It sounds strange at first, even a little ridiculous. But that one line captures everything you need to know about the mind we're about to explore. This is the mind of Dostoevsky's underground man, a nameless narrator who isn't just a character in a book, but a warning. He's someone so painfully self-aware that it becomes impossible for him to live normally. He sees through everything, every motive, every illusion, until nothing feels real or worth believing in. He's smart enough to understand the world, but too conscious to take part in it. And that's where the real tragedy begins. And strangely, he feels very familiar. Because we live in an age overflowing with information. And still, so many of the brightest minds are quietly miserable. Highly educated, deeply reflective, and exhausted. People today are asking the same questions he once asked from a dim St. Petersburg basement. What's the point? Why act at all? Why even get out of bed if everything has already been calculated, predicted, or determined by society, biology, or algorithms? The underground man is what happens when thought turns in on itself. When consciousness becomes too sharp, too detailed, not a gift, but a wound. He calls it an illness. And he's right. He's often called the first existentialist, but that label doesn't quite capture the depth of his despair. He isn't just angry at the world. He's angry at the cold rationalism that wants to simplify human life into formulas, at the naive optimism that believes people can be engineered into happiness. He knows better, or at least he thinks he does. So, why are modern intellectuals like the underground man so often unhappy? Why do those who think the most suffer the most? To answer that, we have to go underground. I am a sick man. I am a spiteful man. I am an unpleasant man. This isn't just a confession. It's a eulogy for a man who is still alive. From the very first lines, the underground man announces not just his physical illness, but a spiritual rot, a slow inner death that intellect alone cannot cure. And perhaps, in a strange way, this makes him more modern than we'd like to admit. He's not merely unhappy, he's hollowed out. A man who no longer believes in anything worth striving for. A former government clerk who stayed in a miserable job only because he needed to eat, until an inheritance allowed him to retreat fully from the world. But that freedom didn't liberate him. It turned into confinement. With no friends, no family, and no meaningful purpose, he retreated into a dim apartment buried in a corner of St. Petersburg, like a man sealing himself inside a tomb. This isn't laziness. It's something colder, something deeper. He acknowledges that his liver is failing and still refuses to see a doctor. Not because he doubts the science, but because he wants the pain. He admits quite openly that he's hurting himself just out of spite. And that spite is all he has left. When there's no joy, no drive, and no faith in people or ideals, even suffering becomes a strange kind of identity. He says it bluntly, let it get worse. Why bother getting better when you no longer see the point in anything? His heightened awareness, his endless thinking, his sensitivity, these don't make him stronger. They trap him. The result of too much consciousness is inertia. Thought without direction becomes paralysis. This is the paradox at the heart of the modern intellectual crisis. The more people learn, the more reasons they find to despair. As one ancient proverb put it, he who increases knowledge increases sorrow. The underground man lives that sorrow minute by minute, trapped in self-awareness that gives him clarity, but no comfort. Today's thinkers might not live in crumbling apartments, but the emotional reality isn't so different. Many of them feel disconnected from their work, drained by endless news cycles, stuck in loops of analysis and critique. They overthink everything: career, purpose, morality, even human connection. In a world without shared truths or spiritual grounding, the mind can become a prison, and intelligence a burden. Modern psychology has a word for what he felt: anhedonia, the inability to feel pleasure. Not sadness exactly. something worse, numbness, tedium. The underground man admits that he's crushed under the weight of monotony, that nothing excites him, that nothing matters. So he fills the silence with cheap comforts, daydreams, imaginary conversations, and tea. Not because they satisfy, but because they keep the void at bay for another hour. This spiritual fatigue is common today. Many people, especially the highly educated, report feeling emotionally exhausted, not because their lives are difficult in a traditional sense, but because the purpose has quietly drained out of their days. Thought has replaced action. Observation has replaced living. They scroll endlessly, read constantly, reflect endlessly, yet rarely feel alive. The underground man saw this coming long before the internet, before therapy apps, before late-night existential podcasts. He knew that if you take away meaning and replace it only with self-awareness, all you're left with is a man staring at his own decay, not acting, not building, just observing, and resenting everything, including himself. And in that sense, he's not so different from the disillusioned minds of today, those who've outgrown belief but not replaced it with anything real. Those who measure truth but feel nothing. Those who are not yet dead but already feel hollow. And in all this emptiness, they avoid challenges in their lives, which I will discuss now. In order to act, one must be absolutely sure of oneself. But how am I, for example, to be sure of myself? For the underground man, life is never just about doing. It's about justifying, analyzing, and dismantling every possible reason for doing anything at all. He doesn't simply hesitate. He unravels the very concept of action itself. His thoughts loop endlessly, dissecting every motive until nothing is left but doubt. He believes that only fools act quickly because they are stupid and limited, and that intelligence, real intelligence, demands hesitation, deliberation, and ultimately inaction. This self-imposed paralysis becomes his prison. The smarter he sees himself, the more he doubts every impulse. Every potential action drags behind it a chain of philosophical uncertainties. What if I'm wrong? What if this isn't the best move? What if I look foolish? And so, rather than risk error, he chooses to do nothing at all. He even admits that this spiral leaves him crushed with tedium. But the price of avoiding life is steep. He avoids confrontation not out of fear of others, but from fear of looking undignified. His imagined superiority prevents him from taking part in the messy reality of human interaction. He dreams of humiliating old classmates who dismissed him, fantasizes about asserting power, but he never lifts a finger. When he finally forces himself to show up at a farewell dinner, uninvited, he's ignored and left behind. His rage festers. But again, he does nothing. Not because he lacks willpower, but because he believes that the world is unworthy of his involvement, unless everything can be controlled, calculated, and perfect. This mindset, far from being unique to him, is everywhere today. In modern intellectual life, this tendency is called analysis paralysis, when overthinking prevents any real decision or progress. It's the fear of doing something imperfect that keeps someone doing nothing at all. And so, many gifted minds never build, never lead, never risk. They sit with their ideas, endlessly revising, endlessly preparing, waiting for a certainty that never comes. Let the world go to hell, but I should always have my tea. That's how the underground man sums up his position. As long as he can sit comfortably, avoid judgment, and stay protected within his intellect, he'll let everything else collapse around him. He mocks other people's efforts, judges them silently, but steps into nothing himself. He calls this wisdom. But really, it's fear in disguise. We see this mirrored today in people who live in ideas but avoid life. The academic who critiques systems but fears participating in them. The entrepreneur who has 5 perfect business models but never starts. the writer who has 100 drafts but never presses publish. In each case, the refusal to risk failure is framed as intellectual seriousness. But it's not. It's evasion. The underground man believes that a truly intelligent person cannot become anything at all, that the moment you act, you compromise your purity. And so, he lets life pass him by. His sense of superiority shields him from embarrassment, yes, but it also shields him from intimacy, growth, and meaning. When he finally tries to connect with Liza, a prostitute, it's not out of love or compassion. It's an attempt to dominate, to feel important. And when she sees through him, when she offers him genuine affection, he recoils. He insults her, pushes her away, because real connection requires vulnerability. And vulnerability is something he cannot allow himself. The underground man doesn't fail because he's weak. He fails because he waits for the perfect reason to act. And in that waiting, life evaporates. Modern intellectuals, just like him, often tell themselves they're too thoughtful to act, too aware to commit, too sophisticated to make mistakes. But this self-image becomes their curse. They retreat into theories, simulations, and safe opinions. Like the underground man, they begin to enjoy their inaction, mistaking it for moral clarity or philosophical superiority. But inside, resentment builds. There is another factor which helps him hide in that cage, which I am going to discuss now. I swear, gentlemen, that to be too conscious is an illness, a real, thoroughgoing illness. There is a peculiar kind of suffering that only the thinking man knows, the kind that doesn't scream but simmers, slowly eating away at one's will to act. The underground man isn't just introspective, he's a prisoner of introspection. Every decision becomes a dilemma. Every motive is dissected. Every possibility breeds another. He sees through everything, and in doing so, he renders everything meaningless. This is not reflection, it's paralysis. He admits openly that he cannot act unless he is absolutely sure of himself. But how can anyone be sure in a world where causes multiply infinitely, where every decision splinters into countless outcomes? Each of my primary causes pulls along another, even more primary cause, and so on ad infinitum. It's a philosophical feedback loop that traps him. He's not waiting for the right time. He's waiting for absolute certainty, for metaphysical permission to live, and that never comes. So he thinks, and thinks, and thinks.
This obsessive overthinking is not a noble pursuit of truth. It is a form of avoidance. The intellectual illusion that the more you think, the closer you are to clarity. But in reality, the mind begins to suffocate on its own smoke. One psychological analogy calls this the centipede's dilemma, when a creature becomes so conscious of its movements that it forgets how to move at all. That's exactly what happens to the underground man. And it's what happens to many bright minds today. A young thinker scrolling through opinions, facts, crises, and contradictions begins to internalize a cruel rhythm. There's always more to consider, always another layer, another possible failure to avoid. One starts out seeking clarity and ends up fearing reality. He is not free in his awareness. He is trapped by it.
There's a passage in modern psychology that puts it plainly. Rumination, or obsessive introspection, rarely solves real problems. Instead, it keeps people emotionally disconnected from what truly needs to be felt. You can map out 100 scenarios, yet none will prepare you for the vulnerability of experience. As one philosopher put it, you can't swim by reading the physics of water. Eventually, you have to get in. The underground man never gets in. He lives alone, both physically and mentally. He avoids joy because joy is messy. He avoids purpose because purpose requires commitment, and commitment terrifies him. In modern life, this is more common than we'd like to admit. Overthinkers often talk about purpose, but cannot settle on one. They study relationships but avoid real intimacy. They talk endlessly about what's wrong with the world, yet feel powerless to do anything about it. Like the underground man, they live in apartments of their own making, mental spaces lined with doubt, furnished with analysis but barren of action. So what does the underground man teach us? That overthinking is not wisdom, that the mind, left unchecked, can become a cage, that there is a point where the search for truth turns against itself, and truth becomes an excuse to avoid living. And this can lead a man towards a path which is nothing but disaster, which I am going to discuss now. Owing to my unbounded vanity, I often looked at myself with furious discontent, which verged on loathing, and so I inwardly attributed the same feeling to everyone. The underground man doesn't just dislike people, he despises them. He calls his former co-workers stupid, likens them to sheep, and admits that he hated them all, not out of personal grievance, but because they seemed to represent everything he rejected: simplicity, emotional ease, and blind acceptance of life. His contempt is not casual, it's weaponized. He uses it to feel above them, to shield himself from any vulnerability that might come from actual connection. But here's the twist. Beneath all this bitterness lies a deep contradiction. He confesses that at times he thought more highly of those very people than of himself. When they displayed happiness or confidence, he envied it, even as he ridiculed it. This internal war between superiority and inferiority only fuels his rage. His hatred turns inward. He declares himself spiteful and unattractive, terms that reflect his deep-seated self-loathing. He fantasizes about petty acts of revenge, wanting to slap people who ignore or irritate him. Not because he truly believes it would fix anything, but because it would prove, if only for a moment, that he has power. Yet even in these fantasies, he's paralyzed by conscience. He overthinks every imagined confrontation, dissects his motives until they dissolve into shame and self-doubt. He can't act, not out of morality, but because his hyper-awareness disables him. This cycle of contempt, envy, paralysis drives his isolation. His apartment becomes a prison, a self-imposed exile from a world he sees as unworthy and unbearable. He retreats not just from people, but from meaning itself. His scorn becomes a substitute for engagement, his sarcasm a mask for pain. In many ways, this dynamic mirrors the behavior of disillusioned modern intellectuals. When the world seems too foolish, too corrupt, too shallow, contempt becomes a tempting refuge. And in a digital age of endless opinion wars, it's easy to slip into a pattern of judging rather than understanding. Social media echo chambers amplify outrage, reinforcing a sense of elitism. They're idiots, I'm not. But contempt is a poor substitute for purpose. It isolates more than it protects. Psychologically, contempt often masks deeper insecurities, fears of inadequacy, rejection, or insignificance. Just like the underground man, many who lash out do so to avoid facing their own wounds. But in doing so, they sacrifice connection, joy, and even personal growth. Also, there is another thing which underground man had, and most of our modern intellectuals do as well, which makes them look like lonely losers, which I am going to discuss now. An intelligent man cannot become anything seriously, and it is only the fool who becomes anything. The underground man sees his intelligence not as a gift, but as a kind of affliction, one that excuses him from responsibility, while simultaneously isolating him from life. He holds himself to impossible standards, obsessed with appearing clever, refined, and intellectually above the masses. He wants to be seen as extremely intelligent, yet constantly feels that he comes across as foolish, even grotesque. In his own eyes, he's too smart for the real world and too fragile to live in it. He despises the ordinary people around him, the clerks, workers, and citizens who live simply and act without hesitation. Yet, in quieter moments, he confesses an odd admiration for them. He envies their ability to act, to find satisfaction in straightforward duties. To him, those who embrace life's routines without spiraling into existential despair are both foolish and strangely free. It's a contradiction he cannot resolve. He mocks the world for its simplicity, but secretly wishes he could live in it. This belief in his own intellectual superiority becomes a convenient escape hatch. Because he considers himself more developed, he avoids the dull responsibilities others take on. In his bureaucratic job, he intentionally frustrates citizens, taking pleasure in using his petty power to remind them, and himself, that he is above them. He doesn't want to help, he wants to dominate. Not because it changes anything, but because it lets him maintain the illusion of control in a world that otherwise overwhelms him. At the heart of this superiority is cowardice. He calls himself a coward and a slave, not with shame, but with a kind of prideful cynicism. In his view, every decent man must be a coward because the world forces conformity. He rejects rationalism and utilitarianism not just on philosophical grounds, but because they demand action and engagement, things he refuses to give. He claims people obey reason like piano keys, while he resists in the name of free will. But that resistance is hollow. He does nothing. This self-imposed exile is a form of spiritual decay. The more he defines himself by intellect alone, the more emotionally dead he becomes. He can't build anything, can't commit to anything, because that would mean taking the risk of being ordinary. And being ordinary, in his mind, is the ultimate failure. So instead, he retreats into theory, into sarcasm, into bitterness. The underground man is a warning. Pride in intellect alone offers no protection from despair. If anything, it deepens it. His tragic irony is that, in seeking to prove he's more than just a piano key, he becomes less than human, paralyzed, bitter, and alone.